Optimally, this review should have come out a very long time earlier than it is, given how much time passed in between my recording of a Final Fantasy I Let's Play and the conclusion of its posting, i.e. it was multiple months difference. Worse, the Let's Play was done posting in the middle of October 2025, and the clock is very near its turnover to 2026 as of the time of this video's writing, and it is 2026 when I'm finally recording it. Alas, I'm circling back around now, better late than never, as they say. I don't have a ton of experience with Final Fantasy as a franchise overall, but I have really enjoyed everything of it that I have played, and just about all the content regarding the franchise I've watched has been highly enjoyable and encouraged me to play the rest of it. I still have big plans for that kind of thing, but I decided to restart the project after having played the first 3 games a few years back, and then playing 16 at release. I still have a very long road ahead of me that I'm excited for. But every adventure has a beginning. So let's talk about Final Fantasy a little bit. Not too crazy in depth because this is a brief review and not a critical analysis, but just enough to get my surface level thoughts about the game out there on to the brief review. I think that Final Fantasy was technically my first real look into what an RPG is at its core. Not just JRPGs, but RPGs in general, and true RPGs, not just the sort of quasi stuff that games like God of War 2018 or Assassin's Creed Odyssey sort of implement half-heartedly. It's kind of fitting, given that it was also one of the earliest JRPGs and a forerunner in popularizing the genre. I first tried playing it sometime in the late 2020 and early 2021 range of time, if I'm not mistaken, and I got up through, I believe, the first boss, may have even gotten the bridge built, but I didn't play much more than that at the time, I do not think. Even giving the game that much of a try was a big step for me as a gamer, though it probably sounds a bit silly to say. But then in mid-2022, I finally took an opportunity between a reading slump and a sickness to play the first couple Final Fantasy games and most of the third, though that one I restarted/continued, I forget exactly, a while later, like the next year or something. And playing Final Fantasy in 2022, I plowed through it, and I had a phenomenal time. As far as RPGs go, it is clear that Final Fantasy is pretty simple, and understandably so, it is 40 years old at this point. Easy to manage party of 4, only 6 classes to select from, pretty manageable world, and very easy 100% capabilities, no missable items or chests or anything. This made for a very approachable, effective, first-time experience with the genre. I was so happy to work through this on my own, using my knowledge from my first attempt and following through with natural exploration afterwards to get through the campaign. Every step of the way was organic and engaging, and I enjoyed the combat a ton. I was fearful for a long time, not just of playing RPGs in general, but specifically of playing games with turn-based combat, too. I was worried that I wouldn't be into it, that it'd be too slow or too tedious or just straight up unfun. Fortunately, I was wrong. The simple and streamlined design of these old games is snappy enough that it's scarcely even like playing turn-based half the time, no more than playing a simple card game anyway. You select your play, your opponent selects their play, repeat until fight is over, and those turns are very quick. Super easy. And because you can speed up fights and turn on autoplay, which is particularly useful later in the game when you tend to do the same commands against most everything that isn't undead or a boss, I personally didn't end up feeling at the time like any of the first few games were a burden to play from an exploration or combat perspective. I also reflect on my time dealing with side quests and that kind of stuff in Final Fantasy, and I gotta commend how much it engaged me. For so few lines of dialogue and so little direction, I still always knew what it was I was needing to do for both the main quest and for other little tasks given to me by random NPCs. I remember being able to track most of it in my head, and though it can sometimes be tough remembering exactly who gave you which information to find them again later, it was a joy to put things together on my own. I felt like my intelligence was respected, and it was fun to eke out that 100%. Hell, even the bestiary was enjoyable to work through in its own way. Similar to chests and everything, there are not any missable enemies in the game beyond certain points, so I always had the opportunity to grind for missing entries. Even this was fun, because I just enjoyed the combat enough to mindlessly wander halls looking for the appropriate creatures. I suppose I should admit I used a guide to find the creatures I was missing, but I don't think anybody would blame me. If I had to find that mech in the Wind Dungeon halls organically, I don't know I would have had the patience for that, for example. But speaking of, enemy design is largely great. I appreciate the variety there is, but really I just liked being able to test myself against the various bosses as I came across them, making sure I was up to the task. This was a somewhat new experience for me a few years back, being basically my first RPG and turn-based video game combat system, but it was always fun to work through my run of Final Fantasy I. And on the story front, I can understand why some might not be into Final Fantasy I. It's pretty simple, and when it ends up being a somewhat strange and paradoxical time loop game, it can definitely be some cause for whiplash. But I was invested enough in the simple tasks of get the crystals, go back to the old castle, defeat chaos, and return home to keep me going, evidently enough. But there's a sort of charm that makes me appreciate it for what it is, even if it's perhaps a tad bit much. You know, considering the time the original game was made, I have no complaints. But all of this is a sort of amalgamation of my very first impressions of the game a handful of years ago, my first complete run about 3.5 years ago, and my most recent playthrough doing a Let's Play that I recorded halfway through 2025. How specifically did my experience change, if at all, upon my most recent run specifically? Well, to be honest, it's kind of a fascinating story, to me anyway, largely because I surprised myself by how much I actually remembered from the game. If you were to watch the actual Let's Play, you'd find I remember where to go and many things to do so well that I actually wound up completing a couple of side quests, or a couple of missions if you want to call them that, by accident, meaning I had gone to the place for the MacGuffin before I had actually talked to the NPC who would have called me to go find it. There are several instances of this. It was actually quite hilarious. I didn't think I would remember the game that way, but apparently I did. I do not believe I remember either Final Fantasy II or III that well. Actually, I know that I do not. But so, my experience this time was one that went very quickly and smoothly, all things considered. I basically knew the route and the tactics, and I managed to follow through pretty well. The bosses in the interim also went much better than they did my first time, I believe. It was an enjoyable couple days of recording, just blasting through the whole game, and that was that. And ultimately, I came out of that experience feeling similar to how I felt the last few years since I've played all the original NES titles at least once a piece now. Final Fantasy I is probably my favorite of the NES trilogy. Now, before anybody goes yelling at me for that, I have to clarify that I need to replay the other two games before I say that that is certainly the case, but I am fairly convinced that that feeling will hold. There is something to the pretty basic and simple charm of Final Fantasy I that did really strike me. There's something about it being my first true foray into RPGs or turn-based combat in general that evokes a form of nostalgia in me already, and certainly there's something to just how fundamentally satisfying it is to play and enjoy a game on both its terms and your own simultaneously, though I could scarcely hope to express what exactly that sentence is supposed to mean in a concise manner. The point that I'm trying to make is that Final Fantasy I is pretty special to me personally. It's not the craziest game, not the most complex, not the most unique, not the deepest, and certainly not the most brilliant, but in all the ways that truly matter, it managed to capture my heart hook, line, and sinker. And now that I've finally circled around to reviewing this game, I'm really excited to continue once again with my Final Fantasy journey. The fact that I haven't played more of these games yet is not something I love thinking about, but I am very excited to continue on now. Replays of 2 and 3 next, then it'll be the SNES trilogy for the first time. I can't wait.